Pray with me, please. Creator God, as Mary anointed you with the riches of creation, may we see how we are anointed every day by your presence, by the beauty of creation, even with those gray clouds, through the power of your word, through the gift of music. May each of us find ways to turn that anointing around and share that blessing with our neighbors who are in need of love and of justice. And let the church say here at University Lutheran, amen. All right. I'd like to have you just take a moment as you are sitting in the sanctuary, and because oftentimes the sermon right is to be a reflection on the readings of the day, and particularly the gospel. In our sanctuaries, we always have a table, do we not? And in these days, we miss coming around the table. But you have tables where you live, I hope and assume. And you have tables that you have been around for many years. Think for a moment of one or two of those times. For those of us that continue to age, well, that's really all of us, isn't it? Those can be many times at many different tables. But think of one or two. And at those gatherings, not unlike the gathering in Bethany, right? You're with special people that you've known maybe just a short time and maybe for a long time. Maybe it's with your family. And oh my goodness, yeah, it's with my older brother or sister or my spouse. And I'm pausing a bit because oftentimes at these gatherings there are great times. There's joy, there's humor, there's laughter, and I can only imagine that in the home of Bethany. But there's also seemingly, maybe not always, but never far from the surface, some discord and division or a spoiler in the conversation. I've never done that. Let's see, both hands. Yeah. And so we think it was just Judas, don't we? Glad to put my name in there. Well, I don't know about glad, but so I'm thinking of my older brother. I was the youngest of four. And yeah, even though there were some years between us, the one that was just older than me, we'd oftentimes have some fights. And I remember the oldest two, there was only 2 years, having some fights. And there was plenty of room on a farm in Minnesota. Mother would always say, if you're going to fight in the house, get outside, even if it's in the dead of winter. Get outside. No, I don't want you breaking any of my furniture over your spats. But there was one time as the years go on, and our personal rooms are always connected to one way or another, are they not, to what's going on in the world? Though sometimes those are our sanctuaries, are they not, from the world, just like this place. And in 1966, there was something going on in our country, and particularly having to do with another country in another part of the world. And my brother Mark had just graduated from high school and had said to himself, well, what's my choice? Get drafted or enlist. And as one tries to do, you try and do the more honorable thing. And so he enlisted in the United States Army. And so we had a dinner, and I'll be up here all morning, and you'd all leave, and I'd still keep on talking. typical preacher. But as time went on and it came time for him to, after he did his training, go to Germany, and he knew where the next destination was. It wasn't just Germany. And so before he did that, he had some time to come back home. And we had a celebration. But the celebration, just as Jesus came to Bethany and was there with his closest friends, my goodness, they were like family, maybe closer than family, right? Some of your friends, if we had time to break into small groups, yeah, I'm closer to this person than I am my sibling for whatever reason. And keep in mind, the context was, Jesus had just raised Lazarus from the dead. Yeah. Not just some small thing, right? And that gets some news. Well, the fears in the Minnesota farm home were significant. But like good Lutherans, they were unspoken. Maybe not like good Lutherans. Because we knew there were tumultuous times in our country, even as protected as we were in rural Minnesota, we knew the racial upheavals going on if we just traveled north to the Twin Cities, much less what we saw on TV in terms of the burnings and the upheaval going on in a neighborhood called Watts in Los Angeles. And as we know our history and should know our history, and how I should know our history as a country, as a white man, it wasn't the first time. And what were the reasons for what was going on in Watts? So there were great divisions coming forward in this country. And in today's text, let me read just a little bit of what maybe some of the unspoken fears were going on with Jesus, as if you need to hear that, right? This is right before chapter 12 begins. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. And the people were looking for Jesus. And were asking one another as they stood there in the temple, "What do you think? What do you think? Surely he won't come to the temple, will he?" They were having Jesus back, weren't they? Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who knew where Jesus was should let them know so that they might arrest him. And in terms of who we associate with, that can sometimes get us into trouble, can it not? And so the verses that follow our gospel text. When the great crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there in the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, they came not only because Jesus was there, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. And so the chief priest planned to not only put Jesus to death, but to put Lazarus to death, since on account of him, many of the Jews were deserting and believing in Jesus. In our gospel, we know of the anointing and the great extravagance. I don't know that I've ever smelt nard. But I tried it. What is this? And of course, like most perfumes, comes from a plant. Spikenard. And I'm thinking of two things that, of course, is going on in John's mind as he's thinking of his readers who are going to read this, and thinking of the extravagance of a miracle and of our lectionary journey as we go through Lent. Right, last Sunday was the parable of the prodigal son, prodigality, much grace. And Mary was giving that to Jesus, whom she loved. And there was the old sniper, the snippet sniper Judas. Don't you know we've got to help the poor, Jesus? And Jesus' response is so good. Your homework assignment is to turn to the 5th book of Moses, of Deuteronomy 15, where this verse actually comes from. And of course, like most lectionaries, it's a cut and paste type of thing. So Deuteronomy 15, in terms of, and when you finally get to the poor will always be with you, that's the actual cut and paste phrase. It's a great ethical teaching about neighbor love. And the miracle, the anointing, the blessing that Jesus gave just a few days ago to Mary and to Martha. Remember their response to Jesus. You're a little late, he's dead. You're a little late, Jesus. And the raising of the dead. And remember that phrase, I just love it. He stinketh. If you go back to the King James, right? Yeah. Human bodies do that after they die and when they're not taken care of by the undertaker. And so you see the contrast that John beautifully puts together for us as chapter 12 begins. The beautiful aroma. I smell something fine in this house. And then pointing forward, what do we do with those anointings and those blessings? And Jesus would turn it around in a few days, right? He just used water. But it was the act that was important, right? To his friends, to his disciples, and to Judas. Tomorrow will be the 54th anniversary of another death of a great American, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Happened in a city called Memphis, channeling that song. Memphis was not like we think it's, just one of those southern cities in the 60s that had huge racial divides. And well, if you really think that, I don't think you do, you can turn to the Seattle Times, last Tuesday's issue. The lead article was connecting the racist policy of our banking institutions of redlining to environment. In places, the picture was of, what was once a beautiful river flowing with all kinds of curves. The Duwamish got straightened out for business reasons. And one of our great advocates from the Latinx and from other communities is pictured in terms of their work to try and do what they can for the communities that surround this now, and it has been for a couple of decades, Superfund River. But we know that King was in Memphis for a particular reason, and he was invited there, and he had been invited several times as it got to be March and April of 1968. Because men, particularly black men, were being horribly mistreated in their work of cleaning up other people's garbage by the white leadership of the city. And as was always the case when Dr. King's travels around in terms of the black church, which church would get Dr. King to come and speak. Because obviously in Memphis there was just a few black churches. Because they wanted to be anointed. In my opening prayer, we get anointed every Sunday. To whatever degree we let that anointing come in from the beautiful music to the reading of the Word and to the spoken Word. And let me tell you, if you were sitting in the pews and the spoken Word was coming from Dr. King, yeah, that would be a special anointing. And on April 3rd, in the evening of April 3rd, that was even a more special anointing, the mountaintop speech. Speaking of Deuteronomy. At the end, Moses climbs to Mount Nebo and looks over, and King had a lot of pressures on him. A year before, to the very date, in April 3rd of 1967, he gets up at the Riverside Church in New York City and says, there's something wrong with this country being in Vietnam. And a man by the name of Lyndon Baines Johnson says, that ain't good, Martin. And so we know what happened the next day. That great anointing, that great blessing, the great vision, the great dreamer was leveled by a pretty powerful rifle coming from across the street. And so what do we do with these anointings? From Jesus, from Mary, from Dr. King, from last Sunday's great gospel lesson of the prodigal son. And we do only one thing that we can do, and that is turn it around. Turn it around to someone we know or don't know. This congregation has done this for many decades, and I pray that you will continue to. I know you will. A lot of people below this sanctuary in another special place, right? A protective place. This is not the only sanctuary in this building. And there are many places like that all around this city, state, and country. And I think Jesus' point to Judas is, remember the situation of where you're in, and let that be enjoyed. And then you know that God will give you the energy and the day to move on from that dinner table, to move on from the dinner table here, or as the dinner table has changed. But you know what I mean, and we continue to bless and to share that anointing with others. And let the church say,